Good morning, my name is Liz Schnackenberg. I'm a hydrologist with U.S. Forest Service, and I will give you an overview of our process. It's what we do in the United States. I think it works well with the United States. I've also done some work in Australia and Portugal, and this is actually a photo from Portugal that you see there. I also think that there may be bits and pieces that you may be able to adapt. So just to walk through it, the first thing is what we focus on is the burned area emergency response. And so what that means, what we're really focusing on are those immediate threats to life and safety, to property, and what we call critical natural or cultural resources. So natural resources could be water quality, it could be wildlife habitat. And cultural resources obviously are those historic resources. And then to identify actions that can manage those risks. We can't always eliminate the risk, so sometimes it's a matter of managing it. So our process is pretty simple. It's 6 steps. The first thing, though, that we do is we identify what we call critical values. And what that means is what are the things that we care about? Because we can't address everything that happens after a fire. We just don't have the capacity. So do we care about water quality? Do we care about weeds coming in? Do we care about debris flows, taking out a highway? I mean, just what do we care about? Because by identifying what we care about, then that helps us to focus the rest of our assessment. The second thing is, once we've identified what is it that we care about, then what is it after a fire that could be a threat to those things we care about. So an example would be if you have a native plant community and you're worried that weeds will come in, then the threat is the invasion of weeds. Conversely, if you're worried about water quality, then the threat is erosion and runoff of sediment, metals, that kind of thing that could affect water quality. So once you know what it is we care about, then what it is, how could it be affected, then the next thing you do is think about how big of a threat is that. So again, if I'm worried about weeds, are there weeds present in the area? Are the soils, has the situation been created where the weeds will do well? Conversely, if I'm worried about water quality, how much erosion is likely to happen? How much runoff is likely to happen? So once we've identified those things, then we can say, okay, I have this concern, I have this value, this thing I care about. The threat is, say it's erosion and runoff to affect water quality, and that it's a high risk, for whatever reason. Then we develop, I'll call it treatments, and that is more actions to address that concern and to mitigate the risk. So if I'm worried about weeds, maybe we do some mulching, maybe we do some seeding. If I'm worried about water quality, maybe we do something to minimize erosion and runoff. And then, after that, we essentially just summarize our findings and, identify a path forward. So that's the process. And then finally implement. And this is just an example of Forest Service critical values. I'm not, again, for Ukraine, you would develop your own list of those critical values, those things that you care about. So, when we think about those, like I said, this is just that first step. Is it life safety that something's going to affect that? Is it property? Is it our resources? Like I already said, what's the threat? And this is just a list of things that commonly occur in the United States. It certainly could be different in Ukraine. And then this matrix really helps us to focus both our assessment and our efforts. And so we look at, on the vertical left side there, what's the probability that some bad thing is going to happen? If it's very likely or likely to happen, and you can see those definitions are underneath there, and it would be a major, impact, then that gives us a reason to do something. And so you can see everything that's in red there, you know, if your matrix points to that, says, yeah, this warrants doing something, we should consider actions. If it's in the white, you know, some of those white boxes there, then it's like, well, yeah, it may happen, but it just doesn't really warrant taking an action. And the yellow are in between, you know, just something that we think about. So in order to define that risk, one of the important things is really what has been the effect of the fire. And from our standpoint, it's the effect of the fire on the soils. And a lot of times, at least here in the United States, you know, they'll talk about that was a really intense fire. And that could be that the trees, you know, you could see a lot of torching in the trees, you can see a big smoke column, and it looks like, oh my gosh, that's a really intense fire. But if the fire only burns in the tops of the trees and never gets down on the ground and you know, doesn't do much to touch the soil, then really you're not going to have a big change from a post-fire perspective. Yes, the trees are dead, but the soils are still intact. They haven't really been affected. Conversely, if you do have, say, a lot fire get on the ground, and if it consumes a lot of the, you know, the organic matter, whether it's the leaves or dead grasses or needles, whatever it might be, that can really have an effect on the soil. So it's a matter of how much the soil heats, because that will change soil properties. And it's that change in soil properties that really drives the post-fire response. So if you lose soil productivity, if you will increase erosion and runoff, and you could create a better reed bed. So just a little time on this, but just because it's the trees burn, it doesn't mean that the soils have had a major change to them. They certainly could have, but it's not always the same thing. So I think you, from what I've seen, you use a similar process for looking at how the effects of the fire, at least to start with, and you use satellite imagery comparing pre-fire imagery to post-fire imagery. And I may be wrong on that, but that's what it appeared from what I have seen. And so that's just a slide showing that. And so that imagery that I was talking about, the pre-fire versus the post-fire, creates an example, or kind of our start at what the effect on the soils is. And so and BARC is burned area reflectance classification. Again, that's just our terminology. So this is an initial satellite image from a fire that I worked on. And the southern part of the fire has one vegetation type, and the northern part has another vegetation type. And so what we do then is we go out on the ground and we look to see what's the effect of the fire on the soils. And so we're looking at different things, looking at what's the char depth, how much of the organic matter, so the leaves, the litter, the needles on the top, how much has the soil structure been changed, and I should hopefully be able to show you that. And then sometimes you'll develop this reduced infiltration. And so it's those things in the soil, how they change, that really affects the post-fire. So this is an example here on the left side there. You can see that's, you know, unburned. And so you have good ground cover, good organic matter. You have the root density, so those roots are really critical to helping to hold the soil together, to preventing erosion. And you know, you have essentially good soil structure. On the right side, you can see all of the organic matter has been consumed. And so that results in you have this thick ash layer. The surface structure has been destroyed. There is no soil cover, and the roots were completely consumed. And so those changes in soils, that's what affects how much your floods or your increased runoff you're going to have, the rates of erosion, your potential for vegetation recovery, geologic response, which I don't think is much of a concern, at least in the Chernobyl area because it's fairly flat. But really that all is how much is going to happen both on the site and then maybe is going to move downstream off the burned area, but could affect areas downstream. So this is an example here of where we had high intensity fire because everything was consumed in the canopy. But you can also see it was high soil burn severity because you've got the thick ash, that gray, there is no organic matter left. This is an example of a fire where because of an inversion, the tops of the trees really didn't burn, but the fire burned a lot along the ground, and it completely consumed the organic. And it actually resulted in a great effect to the soils, but not really a great effect to the tops of the trees. So soil structure, this is an example, and I don't know how much you know about, or if we have soil scientists or not, but soils have a certain amount of structure. The organic matter helps to hold it together. The roots do, but also just there's a certain, the organic matter. And so on the top of this picture, on the top of the shovel, that's a picture of unburned soil, and you can see you have good soil structure. It holds together in the clumps, and then you can see the roots also are helping to hold it together. On the bottom of that picture, you have soil that has had a lot of heating or high soil burn severity, and you can see there's nothing holding the soil together. There's no roots. It's just essentially, it's not quite sand, but there's nothing holding it together. So that is how fire changed that soil in that area, and why it results in the increased runoff, erosion, loss of soil productivity. And then I touched briefly on we call it hydrophobicity. That's also called water repellency. And what happens is the organic matters, when they burn, they essentially, volatilize, or they melt, and then they kind of drive down into the soil until they get down to some depth, and then they, where it's cooler, and then they, precipitate out, they just cool down, and they essentially kind of create plastic layer, or this layer where water cannot infiltrate. And that's usually, we usually see it maybe 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters deep, but usually not deeper than that. But the effect of that is, if you were to put plastic on the soil or under that certain, little lower depth of soil, when it rains, the water doesn't infiltrate, and so it ends up running off over the surface, and it takes anything on the surface with it, and so that causes a lot of erosion and a lot of transport of sediments away from the site. So this is just some examples of things I've already talked about, but you can see in the photo on the left, and again, these are, I think, steeper slopes in what you're talking about, but nonetheless, you can still get this. You can see erosion, just all those different erosion rows on the left, and then some of that sediment in the photo on the right, where it's kind of gone down some of the channel. So if you have areas of low to moderate soil burn severity, your root structure is still going to be intact, and your soil structure is still going to be intact. And so it's going to be a much different effect. You're going to have much different post-fire response, at least in terms of precipitation events, but also in terms of revegetation, because you're going to be retaining your soil productivity. So earlier I showed you the one photo of our burn area reflectance classification, those satellite images. So the original image is on the left, and our adjusted image based on what we saw on the ground is on the right. And you can see on the southern or lower end of the map there, we actually found the effect of the soils was much less than what the satellite thought it was seeing. And that was just in that vegetation type. But when we went north, we found that it actually was a greater effect on the soils than what the satellite was seeing. And so we actually increased on that northern end because it was a different vegetation type. So this is just an example how we used our kind of ground information of looking at really what was the effect on the soils to adjust that soil burn severity map. And then this map is what will determine, the flood flows and erosion and that kind of thing. So the other thing, that we think about is what is both the amount and the pattern. And the photo on the left, you can see it's pretty continuous area of high soil burn severity. So there's going to be a lot of runoff and erosion. Where the photo on the right, you can see there's areas that burned a little hotter, but surrounded by areas that didn't burn that hot. And so there'll be a little runoff and erosion, but it will be, buffered and captured in those unburned areas. So it's not only how much of the soil burn severity is high, it's also what's its spatial distribution. So I already talked about increased flood flows, but the main reasons that happens is you lose that ground cover, that organic matter, and that is essentially a sponge that absorbs water and promotes infiltration when it rains. It also prevents raindrop impact, which is a source of erosion. And then I talked about those water repellent soils, that plastic layer where water just can't infiltrate. So those things combined result in increased runoff or increased flood flows. That's just a kind of a graphic of what I was describing there. So what we have found though, and again, this is partly due or largely due because we have steeper slopes, but this is an example of flood flows after a rain event. The line on the bottom, the blue line, shows pre-fire that we really hardly had any runoff at all, and that the peak was somewhere around 70 minutes after it started raining. But the red line shows after the fire that you have substantially higher flows or substantially higher runoff, and that it happens much earlier after a rain event because there is no infiltration, there's nothing there to slow things down, it just runs off. And so this is just an example of a map that shows our areas of greatest concern. The area highlighted in red is where we expect to see the greatest runoff effects. And orange is a little less, and then green is less. I don't think in the normal area you have this problem, but mud and debris flows are something else that we think about, and there may be other areas in Ukraine that this would be relevant. And they definitely will increase after fires. So one thing we find though, and again, this is just our area, is that it takes 1 to 3 years for vegetation to start stabilizing things, but usually things recover pretty well. You can see the photo on the top that's 1 year after a fire, and then the photo on the bottom is that same area, similar area, 2 years after the fire. So you can see we did have a lot of erosion and sediment movement, but with revegetation that declines and it recovers over time. So those immediate post-fire flooding, erosion, runoff, those will decrease with that revegetation. And so just real quick here to show an example of how our BAER assessment process works. We went and identified the different values that we care about. This is an area, a very high use area with an interstate, Columbia River Gorge, a lot of people in this area. And so, we had a lot of different concerns. But when we went and worked through our process, and looked at our mapping, we looked at our soil burn severity map and debris flow map, which is what you're seeing on the right side, and we looked at our flood flow map, which is what you're seeing on the left side. We used those maps and those tools, that data and information, to say, okay, where are the threats and the risks are the greatest that bad things are going to happen that we need to do something. And so by using that map, and by using our matrix, which I talked about earlier, we really narrowed it down to there's only a few things that we need to worry about. And those are highlighted in red. There was a road we were worried about, we were native plant communities, and then human life and safety. But the other things we were able to say, yes, there's going to be a post-fire effect, but we don't think it's that great. And so we don't need to do something about it. So that's just a brief overview. I'd say the keys to our success, or the things that I really think work for us, are one is we have a standard process. And it's something that we all generally know the process, and so we're able to kind of follow that along. And then we also have a variety of different scientists working on it. So we have a soil scientist, a hydrologist, an engineer, maybe a weeds person, and it all depends on the fire. But it's that the different resources working together. I am a hydrologist, so that's my specialty, but I work with the soil scientist, and by doing that, together we come up with, okay, here's the post-fire effect.